All right, here we go with objective 66, solving quadratic equations by the quadratic formula. So I just want to do a quick recap how we've learned how to solve quadratic equations. Well, we've learned how to solve them by factoring and solving using the zero product property, and then also by square roots. So as a reminder, the ways that we can factor a quadratic are finding the GCF, or the greatest common factor, just factoring quadratics by finding the factors of the third term and then seeing if they add up to the second term. So quadratics. And then the last way that we learned is finding differences of squares. So these are the three ways that we can factor quadratics. So the GCF, factoring quadratics regularly, and then finding difference of squares. Solving equations using square roots, well, that was when we had an x squared or parentheses squared. Those are the last two objectives. So let's take a look at this first example. We have x squared plus 6x plus 4. Well, let's see if we can factor it. I'm looking at this and we're going to try a GCF. Well, the numbers out in front, the number in front of this x is 1. When it's not written, it's 1. And then we have 6 and 4. Well, we could pull out a 1, but there's no number bigger that goes into all 1, 6, and 4. So we can't pull out any numbers there. And then the variables, well, this has x squared, this has x, and this doesn't have any x's. So we can't pull out any variables either. So GCF is not possible. We can't pull out a GCF. Seeing if there are numbers that multiply to 4 that add or subtract to negative 6 or positive 6. Well, let's see. Factors of 4, we've got 1 and 4, and we have 2 and 2. Is there any combination of these factors that can add or subtract to get positive 6? Well, 1 plus 4 is 5. It's not quite there. 2 plus 2 is 4. Yeah, there's not really any way that we can get to 6. So we can't do that. This isn't a difference of squares either. So we can't factor it. Let's take a look at square roots. Does it have just an x squared or a parentheses squared? Well, we've got an x squared and an x. If we didn't have this x term, if it was just x squared plus 4, then we could try to solve this using square roots, but we've got that x term there, so we can't solve using square roots. So you might be thinking already, well, we can't solve this, right? But the fact of the matter is, yes, we're going to learn that way today. That's using the quadratic formula. So yes, we can solve this. We're going to use the quadratic formula. So taking a look at this definition, we're going to be solving quadratics using the quadratic formula. Solving quadratics using the quadratic formula. So if you remember back when we first talked about quadratics, the standard form for a quadratic is y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. So we write these in descending power order from the x squareds to the x terms to the constants, or just the numbers, where a, b, and c are just the numbers in front of the variables, or the coefficients. The quadratic formula, I'm going to go ahead and write it out. It's kind of a big one. We have x equals negative b, or opposite b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and all of that is over 2a. So yes, it's a little big, but I've got a song that can help you remember it. So we can remember this by remembering the tune to the song Pop Goes the Weasel, right? We can sing it out and we say x equals opposite b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So that's one way that we can remember the song, just using that tune. So as a reminder, a, b, and c in this formula are just the numbers in the equation. A, b, and c are the numbers in the equation. All right. So let's take a look at some of the steps that we use to follow this. The first thing that we have to do is set the equation equal to 0. You always have to, before using the quadratic formula, you have to set the equation equal to 0. So looking at this example over here, it's already equal to 0. So we're good there. We don't have to move any terms around. We don't have to manipulate it in any way. Step 2 is to determine A, B, and C. So figure out what those coefficients are. So A is always the number in front of the x squared term. B is always the number in front of the x term. And then C is just that number, that constant. It helps if you write it in descending power order or standard form. So determine A, B, and C and plug it into the quadratic formula. All right. And then step 3 is just to solve. So solve for the variable. All right, so set it equal to 0. Figure out what those coefficients are, A, B, and C. Plug it into the quadratic formula, and then just solve for the variable. So let's do that over here. We've got the number in front of the x squared term. Well, there's nothing written, so we can assume that the number in front is 1. The number in front of the x is 8, and the constant is 6. So some students like to write it out. I encourage that. A equals 1, B equals 8, and C equals 6. So remember, it's just the numbers out in front. It's not including x, just the numbers out in front. So now we can plug it into our quadratic formula. So let's go ahead and plug it in, and I'll go ahead and sing the song. We have x equals negative b. It's negative 8 plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac. So b squared is 8 squared. B squared minus 4ac. So a is 1 and c is 6. So times 1 times 6. All over 2a. So all over 2 times a is 1. So there we go. We plugged in everything into our quadratic formula. So now we can just solve, simplify the right-hand side of this equation. So we have x equals negative 8, or opposite 8, plus or minus the square root of, well, 8 squared is 8 times 8, or 64. And we have minus, well, 4 times 1 times 6. Well, 4 times 1 is 4, times 6 is 24. So we have 64 minus 24 in the radical. And then all over, well, 2 times 1 is just 2. All right, let's keep going. We have x equals negative 8 plus or minus. Well, inside the radical, 64 minus 24 is 40. So we have plus or minus the square root of 40 over 2. Are we done yet? Not yet. We've got to simplify that radical. So let's go off to the side here. I've got the square root of 40. I can break that up into 4 and 10. And I can keep breaking that up. I can break down 4 into 2 and 2. And I can break up 10 into 2 and 5. And I can't break it up anymore. So let's start using the jailbreak method. We pull out pairs. So this comes out front, a pair of 2s, and that's it. There's no other pairs. So we've got a 2 out in front, and then what's left inside? 2 times 5. So that gives us 2 root 10. So we can rewrite the square root of 40 as 2 times the square root of 10. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, rewrite it. So we have negative 8 plus or minus 2 root 10, and that's all over 2. Now we can continue to simplify this. Remember when we're multiplying and dividing radicals, we divide out the numbers out in front, right? So numbers with numbers, radicals with radicals. So if we're dividing all this by 2, well, we can divide everything by 2. So that negative 8 gets divided by 2, and the number out in front of the radical gets divided by 2. A lot of students will just divide by that first one and then forget the radical. Remember, you have to divide it by everything. So we have x equals, well, negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. And then we have 2 divided by 2 is just 1. So we can say plus or minus 1 root 10. Now, using what we know about plus or minus, we can break that up into 2 equations. We can say x equals negative 4 plus 1 root 10 is just root 10. You can write out 1 root 10, or you could just write root 10. And then the other equation is that minus. So we have x equals negative 4 minus root 10. So these are our two solutions. We have negative 4 plus root 10 and negative 4 minus root 10. So even though we couldn't factor or solve using square roots, there is still a solution, and it uses a quadratic formula. So some of you might be wondering, well, what if I could factor it? Does the quadratic formula work for that? It sure does. The quadratic formula will always work. If the quadratic has a solution, the quadratic formula will find it. So we can always use that, but as you can see, it's kind of a lot of work. It uses radicals, it's a lot of simplifying, a lot of steps. So use this as a last resort. This always works, but use it as a last resort. Always check and see if you can factor first or solve by square roots. And then if you can't, then choose the quadratic formula. All right. So we're going to get a whole lot of practice on this. Again, remember this formula. You can remember it using the song. And we'll see you tomorrow. All right. Have a great day.